Welcome back. Today we're diving into the book of First Chronicles, one of the most overlooked yet powerful books in the Bible. At first glance, it may seem like a book filled with long genealogies and historical records, but beneath the surface is a message about God's faithfulness, His covenant with David, true worship, and the importance of remembering where God's people came from. First Chronicles was written to remind Israel of their identity and encourage them to remain faithful to God after returning from exile. The book begins with an extensive genealogy that traces history from Adam all the way to the nation of Israel. Starting with Adam, the writer moves through the generations of Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 tribes of Israel. These genealogies are more than a list of names. They establish God's ongoing plan throughout history and show how He preserved His chosen people through countless generations. The genealogy places special emphasis on the tribe of Judah, because it is the royal tribe from which King David and eventually Jesus Christ would come. The descendants of Judah are listed in detail, highlighting important families and leaders. The genealogies also cover the tribes of Benjamin, Levi, Ephraim, Manasseh, and the other tribes of Israel. Special attention is given to the Levites because they were responsible for serving in the worship of God. The writer carefully records their duties and lineage, showing the importance of proper worship and service before the Lord. The story then shifts to King Saul, Israel's first king. Saul had been chosen by God but repeatedly disobeyed Him. Because of his unfaithfulness, God removed the kingdom from Saul and gave it to David. Saul and his sons died in battle against the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. The book explains that Saul died because he was unfaithful to the Lord, and even sought guidance from a medium rather than seeking God. His death marked the end of his dynasty and opened the door for David's reign. David is then presented as the central figure of First Chronicles. All Israel comes together and recognizes David as king. The people acknowledge that God has chosen him to shepherd and lead the nation. David captures Jerusalem from the Jebusites and establishes it as the capital city of Israel. Jerusalem would become the political and spiritual center of the nation for generations. As David's kingdom grows stronger, he seeks to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. The Ark represented God's presence among His people. During the first attempt, David places the Ark on a new cart. As it is being transported, Uzzah reaches out to steady it when the oxen stumble. Because God had commanded that the Ark be carried only by Levites using poles, Uzzah's action violates God's instructions. God strikes him dead, and David becomes fearful and confused. After seeking the Lord and understanding God's commands more fully, David organizes a second attempt to move the Ark. This time it is carried according to God's instructions. The journey is filled with celebration, music, singing, and worship. David dances before the Lord with all his might, rejoicing that God's presence is coming to Jerusalem. This event becomes one of the most joyful moments in Israel's history. David appoints Levites, musicians, singers, gatekeepers, and priests to minister before the Lord continually. Worship becomes a central focus of the kingdom. David composes songs of thanksgiving and praise, encouraging the people to remember God's mighty works and proclaim His greatness among the nations. The message is clear that worship is not simply a ritual, but a heartfelt response to God's faithfulness. One of the most significant moments in the book occurs when David desires to build a permanent temple for God. He feels that it is inappropriate for him to live in a palace while the ark remains in a tent. Through the prophet Nathan, God responds with a surprising message. David will not build the temple. Instead, God promises to establish David's house forever. God declares that one of David's descendants will sit on the throne and that David's kingdom will endure. This covenant becomes one of the most important promises in Scripture because it points forward to Jesus Christ, the eternal King who would come from David's lineage. David responds to God's covenant with humility and gratitude. He prays before the Lord, acknowledging that everything he has comes from God. He marvels that God would show such favor to him and his family. His prayer reveals a heart devoted to honoring God above personal ambition. The narrative continues by describing David's military victories. With God's help, David defeats the Philistines, Moabites, Edomites, Ammonites, Syrians, and other enemies. The Lord gives him victory wherever he goes. These victories establish Israel as a powerful and secure nation. The focus is not on David's military skill alone, but on God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. The book also records David's kindness to Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan. Although Mephibosheth belongs to Saul's family, David honors his covenant friendship with Jonathan by showing mercy and restoring his family's inheritance. This act demonstrates David's character and loyalty. As David's reign continues, preparations begin for the future temple. Although God has told David he will not build it, David dedicates himself to gathering materials. He collects gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, precious stones, and countless resources that will be needed for construction. He wants the temple to be magnificent because it is being built for the Lord. David carefully organizes the Levites and priests into divisions. He establishes schedules and responsibilities for those who will serve in worship. Musicians are appointed to lead praise. Gatekeepers are assigned to guard the temple. Treasurers are selected to manage resources. Military leaders and government officials are also organized. Everything is prepared with order and purpose to ensure that worship remains central to the life of the nation. Near the end of the book, David gathers the leaders of Israel and publicly commissions his son Solomon to build the temple. David explains that God specifically chose Solomon for this task. He encourages Solomon to remain faithful, obey God's commands, and seek him wholeheartedly. David warns that success depends not on human strength, but on obedience to the Lord. David then presents the plans for the temple, which he received through divine guidance. The people respond with overwhelming generosity. Leaders and citizens willingly give large amounts of wealth and resources for the project. Their giving reflects hearts devoted to God rather than obligation or pressure. In one of the most beautiful prayers in the Old Testament, David praises God before the entire assembly. He declares that greatness, power, glory, victory, and majesty belong to the Lord alone. He acknowledges that all wealth and honor come from God, and that everything the people have given actually belongs to him already. David's prayer emphasizes humility and gratitude before God. The nation rejoices together, worshiping and celebrating God's goodness. Solomon is officially recognized as David's successor and is anointed as king. The people pledge their loyalty to him, and God blesses his future reign. The book concludes with a summary of David's life. He ruled Israel for 40 years and experienced God's blessing throughout his reign. Although David was not perfect, 1 Chronicles focuses primarily on his faithfulness, leadership, worship, and devotion to God's purposes. The book ends with David's death and Solomon firmly established on the throne. The major themes of 1 Chronicles are God's faithfulness, the importance of worship, the covenant with David, obedience to God's commands, and the preparation for God's dwelling place among his people. The book reminds believers that their identity is rooted in God's promises, that worship should remain central in their lives, and that God always fulfills his word across generations. Most importantly, 1 Chronicles points forward to Jesus Christ. The genealogies trace the royal line that leads to him. The covenant with David anticipates his eternal kingdom. The temple points toward God's presence dwelling among his people. Through every chapter, the book reveals a God who remains faithful to his promises and continues his plan of redemption throughout history. Thank you for joining me as we explored the book of 1 Chronicles. May its message encourage you to remember God's faithfulness, worship him wholeheartedly, and trust that his promises never fail. Until next time, keep seeking his truth and growing in your walk with him.